An abridgment of Thomas Manton's commentary on the Epistle of James, chapter 2, verse 11. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." If you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. James 2 verses 6 to 10 reminded us that the entire law of God is interconnected, and the breaking of one commandment renders a person guilty of violating the whole law. This comprehensive nature of God's law demands total and sincere obedience. Partial obedience or selective adherence to certain commands while neglecting others is not true obedience, for the same divine authority stands behind every command. It is a dangerous presumption to think that obedience in one area can excuse disobedience in another. The law must be followed as a unified whole. James 2 verse 11 builds upon this idea, reinforcing the principle that our obedience is not measured by how well it aligns with our desires or interests, but by our submission to the authority of the lawgiver, God Himself. In this verse, James provides concrete examples by referencing the 6th and 7th commandments, which prohibit murder and adultery, respectively. His argument is clear. He who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." The same God who gave both commandments demands obedience to both because they come from the same source, His divine authority. This underscores that the authority of the law is violated when we transgress even one of these commands. The laws are not arbitrary or disconnected. They are all part of the same moral fabric woven by the will of God. When we break one commandment, we are not merely violating a specific rule, but we are rebelling against the sovereign authority of the lawgiver who issued the entire law. Thus, the violation of one commandment dishonors the lawgiver just as much as the violation of another. James, in referencing these two commandments, provides further clarity when we consider that both offenses, adultery and murder, were punishable by death, Deuteronomy 22 verse 22 and Leviticus 24 verse 17. These were not merely societal rules but divine commands, and the consequence for breaking them demonstrated the seriousness of the offense in God's eyes. He further alludes to the preface of the 10 Commandments, "And God spoke all these words," Exodus 20 verse 1, reinforcing the idea that each commandment flows from the same divine mouth and carries the same divine authority. In applying this verse, we must remember that obedience to God's law cannot be selective. We cannot pick and choose which commandments to follow based on what fits with our personal desires or interests. Each commandment reflects the will of God, and each must be respected as such. The violation of one command is, in essence, a violation of the whole law, because it reflects a rejection of the authority of the one lawgiver. This passage also calls us to a deeper awareness of the seriousness of sin. In the eyes of God, there is no hierarchy of sins that permits us to downplay certain transgressions while emphasizing others. The one who commits murder and the one who commits adultery are equally guilty before God, not because the sins are identical in their consequences, but because they both involve a rejection of God's sovereign authority. True obedience flows from a heart that seeks to honor God in all things, not just in the areas that come naturally or are convenient. We must examine our hearts and motivations to ensure that we are not obeying God selectively or out of mere convenience, but out of a desire to honor His will in all things. This requires humility, as we must recognize that our obedience is not about fulfilling our interests, but about submitting to God's perfect wisdom and authority. James 2 verse 11, therefore, reinforces the truth that the law of God is a unified whole, and obedience to one part of the law cannot excuse disobedience to another. Every command reflects the authority of the lawgiver, and to break one is to dishonor the one who gave the entire law. It challenges us to pursue wholehearted obedience, recognizing that all of God's commands are equally important and deserve our full submission. We must not focus on debating the content of God's commands, but instead submit to the will of the lawgiver. James reminds us that the entire law holds equal weight on the conscience because He who said the one said the other. The authority behind every command is the same, God himself. His will is reason enough for obedience. As Peter writes, "For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people." 1 Peter 2 verse 15. Likewise, Paul reminds us, "It is God's will that you should be sanctified." 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 3. And give thanks in all circumstances. For this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 18. Every sin is an affront to God's sovereignty, as if his will were insufficient to motivate our obedience, and it also insults his wisdom, as if he does not know what is best for us. When we resist any duty, we must reflect on these truths and humble ourselves. This is a test of our sincerity. True obedience is marked by a readiness to fulfill our duties simply because they are God's will, without requiring any other justification. A heart that obeys out of a mere sight of God's will is a heart inclined toward universal obedience, recognizing that every duty, whether great or small, is commanded by the same divine authority. Furthermore, we must acknowledge that there are various duties and corresponding sins according to the different laws of God. We must not, like Herod, hear many things gladly, Mark 6 verse 20, without actually practicing them. The same God who calls us to pray also calls us to listen, to meditate on his word, and to make good use of our time for holy purposes. All commands come from the same source and must be observed with equal seriousness. We cannot take comfort in avoiding certain sins while neglecting others. The Pharisee in Luke 18 could boast, "I am no adulterer," but he could not honestly say, "I am not proud." Let us examine ourselves. Let us not rest in selective obedience, but strive to submit fully to all of God's commands. True holiness does not permit us to be content with merely avoiding some sins while harboring others. Every command reflects the same will of God, and therefore, each deserves our full and careful obedience.